laptop, so the camera quality is quite bad right now. Please try to ignore that. Hello there! Today I'm making a video about how I was diagnosed with Tourette's. Now, although I have the diagnosis of Tourette Syndrome, it's thought that I actually have PANDAS. However, seeing as I have been through the diagnostic process for Tourette Syndrome, I still wanted to talk about it because people, I think, underestimate how hard it can be for some people to get diagnosed. So, I had motor and vocal tics since the age of 8. However, I did not get a diagnosis of Tourette Syndrome until I was 15. And part of the reason for this is because the doctors didn't want to label something very specific, and they were also quite dismissive about it. I was under the care of CAMS from the age of 9, but at that time OCD was what they were really focusing on, not really the tics. So the tics didn't go fully unnoticed, but they weren't really the top priority as to what to focus on. I had a psychologist write that there is the possibility of motor and vocal tics, which would need to be looked into further, and that was sent to my psychiatrists, but they weren't really paying attention to the tics at that point because, again, as I said, they were focusing a lot more on the OCD stuff. Wow! Woo! 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 Parsnip! I eventually got a new psychiatrist because I just thought that I'd get along better with a different one, and eventually at the age of 12 is when me and my family started paying more attention to the possibility of Tourette Syndrome. My mum said to the psychiatrist that she thinks I have Tourette Syndrome, but the psychiatrist was really condescending and was just looking at her like she's stupid and saying, oh no, she doesn't have Tourette's and stuff like that. She wasn't able to really listen to our concerns. And when I brought it up, I actually brought it up myself. I'd been doing research and the Tourette's stuff sounded just like me. I was reading it and everything about it made complete sense. But when I told her about Tourette Syndrome, she said it doesn't affect my life enough. And that was an absolute lie. They were so invalidating because it actually affected me greatly. I had tics that were impacting my walking. I had tics that were causing physical injury. They were impacting me a lot and they were disabling. But because I didn't tic that much in their office, they didn't really see how bad it was. I would subconsciously suppress my tics in the doctor's office, and a lot of people do that. I would suppress without realising, and unfortunately they just didn't really know what it was actually like. They wouldn't really listen. They wouldn't believe us, really. I subconsciously suppressed because the doctor actually scared me quite a bit. I didn't feel comfortable ticking around them. For a long time, I had just possible tic disorder written on my file, but it was never really specified, not for years anyway, and it was really, really frustrating. When me and my parents wanted me to be referred to a neurologist, the psychiatrist sort of had the attitude that it wouldn't matter and that it's far away, it would take a long time to get there. She didn't think it would be worth it, even though me and my family thought it would be worth it, but I did not get the referral. The psychiatrist was just so dismissive and invalidating, and when I was talking to them again about why I think I have Tourette Syndrome, they said, right, what is that then? And I was like, it's a neurological condition characterised by uncontrollable movements and vocalisations called tics. And then she just looked at me and was like, a 12-year-old shouldn't know what that is. And she looked so concerned. And it was just so frustrating because this psychiatrist just would not listen. And it was really, really unhelpful. She kind of assumed that once I got my autism diagnosis, she kind of assumed that everything was autism related. And they did write in my file that my vocal tics may be anxiety or stress related, but a lot of people with Tourette's and PANDAS are misdiagnosed with anxiety tics. So I never actually believed that because I wasn't anxious and I was still ticking when I wasn't anxious. Interestingly, in my autism assessment, the paediatrician actually wrote, Romy's been struggling a lot with her Tourette Syndrome, but I hadn't even been diagnosed then, so I feel like they just assumed that I had been diagnosed. But I hadn't, so that was actually the first time Tourette's was ever mentioned in my medical files, and I was still 12 at this point. But it didn't really count as a formal diagnosis because that was the only mention of it in my medical records, and it wasn't mentioned again for years after, and it wasn't in the diagnosis section, so I think that was the doctor assuming that I must already be diagnosed, but I actually wasn't. The school didn't actually see the extent of my issues either, so they didn't see the extent of my issues with tics until I was 11. I guess that's why I didn't really get a diagnosis sooner, because I would subconsciously suppress in school as well, because I wasn't comfortable ticking freely in school, and that's the thing a lot of people suppress, so the school might not always notice an issue. My mum also mentioned to a psychologist that she thought I might have Tourette syndrome, and the psychologist kind of just looked at her like she was an absolute idiot. So we did face a lot of dismissal, despite me having both motor and vocal tics for multiple years, but we weren't getting listened to, and we weren't getting referred to the appropriate support. So I kind of already assumed I had Tourette's back then, and I was saying I had Tourette's even though I wasn't really formally diagnosed. It had been mentioned in my medical records once, but technically didn't fully count as a formal diagnosis. I went to a Tourette's camp when I was 14 for the first time, and at this Tourette's camp they basically asked when was I diagnosed, and I was actually like, well, I'm actually not formally diagnosed. And they were so surprised because by that time my tics were very, very extreme, very loud yelling phrases, very loud swearing, falling to the ground, hitting myself, very extreme tics, and they were so surprised that I wasn't diagnosed. At this point, thankfully, things in my medical file had moved on from possible tic disorder to tic disorder, which still wasn't specific. It didn't say what tic disorder. There are a bunch of different tic disorders. There's provisional tic disorder, which I couldn't have because that's under a year. Chronic motor tic disorder, which I couldn't have because I had motor and vocal. Chronic vocal tic disorder I couldn't have because I had both motor and vocal. There's Tourette syndrome, there's other things as well. But saying just tic disorder wasn't very specific enough, and it was frustrating because I wanted to have a diagnosis that connected me more specifically to a specific community, and I felt like tic disorder was too vague. There are different tic disorders. I ended up getting formally diagnosed with Tourette syndrome when at this camp people were talking about how they needed the diagnosis to give to the DVLA when they were getting their driving license and stuff, and my parents realised that actually it might help for me to have a formal diagnosis because it would help when I'm older with that sort of thing. Around the same time, my school actually said that I need a formal diagnosis so that I can have extra time on my exams and a separate room. I needed a diagnosis of it. So thankfully that is what led me to eventually seek a formal diagnosis, not from CAMHS, because CAMHS were the ones who were not giving me the formal diagnosis before, so I kind of just assumed that CAMHS were a mental health service. Even though they said they specialised in tic disorders, they didn't seem to be comfortable diagnosing Tourette syndrome. So I went to the GP and basically explained the situation, that I'd been under CAMHS for a long time, but they'd never diagnosed Tourette's. It seems like they just don't diagnose it, but I needed a formal Tourette's diagnosis. So they referred me to I asked to be referred to a neurologist. They referred me to a neurologist first of all, but then the referral got declined. So then I got referred to a paediatrician specialising in neurology, and thankfully that was the referral I could go to. I think it was December the 14th, the day of my referral, prior to needing the diagnosis for my exams and getting older and stuff. It was kind of just thought that I wouldn't need a formal diagnosis because we knew what it was anyway, but again, having a formal diagnosis would help me get support. So I think it was December the 14th, the day of the appointment with the paediatrician specialising in neurology, and we walked into a room filled with like 4 and 5-year-olds. I was the oldest kid there. I was 15, and it was so awkward because it was nearly Christmas and my tics just were yelling, "Santa's not real, Santa's not real," and it was really awkward in a room filled with kids. So the nurse went and took me and my dad to another room. They took my height and weight and then gave me another room to wait in, just me and my dad and no other kids, until the doctor could come and see me. Then the doctor came and saw me, and Bramblebush, they asked a few questions like, do you have a family history of any conditions? And we explained that we have a family history of like anxiety and schizophrenia. And then they asked how long I'd had the tics, and at that point it was like, it was about 7 years I'd had tics at that point. So I told them I'd had them for 7 years, and then within like a couple of minutes they said that I have severe Tourette syndrome. They diagnosed me with severe Tourette syndrome, and there wasn't really any tests needed. They didn't take any blood tests, no brain scans, nothing like that. They just said, you have severe Tourette syndrome, based on how long I'd had the tics and what they looked like and the family history. My tics kept calling the doctor Dr. Shitty, and my tics almost cleared his desk as well. I think they kind of just wanted me out of their office as well. I was so glad to get the formal diagnosis. It was one of the happiest days of my life. I felt validated as part of the community more, and it made me feel more understood. It was good to finally be taken seriously by a doctor, and as well as this, they were really helpful actually. This doctor was really, really nice. They made a list of medications that are usually used for Tourette syndrome. They referred me to occupational therapy, but that referral got declined because then they said they can't help people with Tourette's, like with my issues. But it's still nice of them to refer me. And I also got a referral to psychologists to do sort of therapy on tics to help me redirect, but I didn't really see the point in that for myself because a lot of my tics are one-off, just yelling stuff one-off and that. I didn't see the point in doing competing responses for that because if every tic is different, I don't really have a way to predict it very well, and I don't like the fact that they make you focus on the urge to tic so that it gets stronger, because the urge to tic was a bigger issue for me than the tics themselves. It was very distressing. It was an unbearable sensation, and if they had tried to make me focus on it more, it would have just made my issues worse. So I didn't think that would be good for me, and thankfully I didn't need it anyway because I ended up having dietary intervention, which helped me a lot more at that time. So that is my story.